The old man made his way up the side of the rocky hill with surprising agility. His stride was that of a man many years younger. From a distance, only his brilliant white hair gave away his years. The wind was hot and dry, the sun was bright. As he ascended the mountain, he could see distant landmarks shimmering in the desert heat. He had been called and commissioned to lead God's people for 40 years, and now God had revealed to him that his phase of the work was at its end. Now it was time for him to sleep the sleep of death, to pass from life to life in the resurrection. The last few days had been hectic, so much to be done, briefing his replacements, writing job descriptions, finalizing details, finishing his last book. It was important that things go well. He wanted a smooth transition of authority. When the old man first learned of God's judgment, he was apprehensive for those he had been called to lead, but God had shared with him who was to succeed him, and God's choice gave him a measure of comfort. Yet no one ever really wants to give up the reins. At this time, of all times, it was particularly bitter. It would have been easy to give in to it, he thought. After all, I've been leading God's people for 4 decades. It would seem only fair to let me finish. The old man stopped himself in mid-thought. This won't help, he said to himself. True, I had hoped to do this one last thing, but God said no to my request, and he's always right. I have followed him too far to stop now. As he threaded his way through a concentration of rocks along the steep mountainside, he stopped to look into the shimmering distance and to reflect. Thoughts of his farewell sermon flooded his mind in a flashback. I know how rebellious and stubborn you are, he told them. You are defiant rebels today while I am here. What will you do when I'm gone? He had been awfully strong, perhaps too strong, but then someone had to tell it like it is. That lot had fallen to him for the last 40 years. He continued climbing again. His thoughts wandered back to some of the more intense occasions during his ministry. His audiences with kings, the miracles God performed to save his people, criticism of rebels and the confrontations with them, the corners of his eyes wrinkled and the corners of his mouth turned up slightly. Finally, the weather-beaten countenance broke into a smile. He chuckled within himself. While there was nothing humorous about it at the time, looking back, it struck him funny that when things were going well, God always referred to the children of Israel as my people. But when they were acting stubborn and rebellious, he called them your people. After climbing for some time, he stopped and looked back over the distance he had covered. The huge throng that had been on hand to honor him at his departure had grown small in the distance. He appreciated their concern. It felt like victory to him. It certainly had been a different story when he'd begun his work at first. Some of this crowd's parents had made life more than difficult for him. After reaching the top of the mountain, he looked across the river valley below, and he scanned the lush vegetation growing on the fertile lands before him. Tears filled his eyes. Here at last was the goal of 40 years right before him. 40 years of trial, 40 years of struggle, 40 years of hardship, 40 years of criticism, 40 years of betrayal, 40 years of frustration, 40 years. How long and how short it had been. As his old eyes looked into the vista before him, he understood that this was a monumental moment in history. After 40 years of wandering, Moses was looking at the Promised Land. While he was excited to see it, the sight of it brought an aching sadness to his heart. He wished with all his heart that he had not lost his temper at Meribah. He remembered that day when God told him and Aaron, "Because you believe me not to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this congregation into the land which I have given them." It was ironic. The previous generation of Israelites had been destroyed in the wilderness and were not allowed to enter the Promised Land because of unbelief. Now, after 40 years of faithful service, he found himself excluded for the same reason. He had besought God to change his mind and let him have this one last wish, an old man's heart's desire. But the answer was always and finally no. He didn't like it, but he accepted God's decision. That's in the past now, he reminded himself, and nothing can be done about it. At least God had agreed to show him the land, even though he couldn't enter into it. For that he was grateful. As he looked through eyes that were not dim, he could just barely make out buildings in Jerusalem 30 miles away. He could easily see the Dead Sea and beyond the blue Judean hills. As he strained to see across the miles, God performed one last miracle for this old man. He opened Moses' eyes supernaturally, and as the scripture says, showed him all the land of Gilead unto Dan, and Naphtali, and the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, and all the land of Judah under the uttermost sea, and the south, and the plain of the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees unto Zoar. Moses was called of God at 80 years of age to lead Israel to freedom. He was 120 years old when he died. This presentation is about the man Moses, who forsook fame and wealth in Egypt to follow God into the desert, who was accused by men of being arrogant, and yet was judged the most meek man who ever lived by God. He was a prophet. He was a type of Jesus Christ. He wrote more of the Bible than the Apostle Paul, and his